안녕하세요.
The sound of Italian leather shoes echoed through the luxurious entrance hall of Kang Holdings. Young Min-ho, the CEO of the corporation, crossed the space with his impenetrable expression and overwhelming presence. Employees quickly diverted their gaze, maintaining professional posture. He was known for his cold demeanor and unwavering dedication to business. For Min-ho, feelings were mere distractions that compromised efficiency. However, on that day, an unexpected incident would change the course of his life irreversibly. In the middle of the corridor, Yoon Hana balanced a stack of documents in her arms. Recently hired as an assistant in the administrative department, she was trying to adapt to the pressure of that relentless environment. She knew that Kang Holdings was a demanding place, but she had no idea how much her attention to detail and speed would be tested. In her haste to deliver the papers to the financial department, she didn't see when a tall man approached. The collision was inevitable. Documents flew through the air, scattering across the gleaming marble floor. Time seemed to stand still. Silence took over the room as all eyes turned to the scene. Min-ho stopped abruptly, narrowing his eyes at the woman who was now kneeling, frantically collecting the papers. His jaw tightened. He hated disorganization, and even more, being interrupted by trivial situations. He took a deep breath, maintaining his lofty posture. "Do you have any idea who you just bumped into?" His voice was low, but filled with authority. Hana lifted her gaze and met the dark eyes of the CEO. Her heart raced. There was something about him that exuded an intimidating aura, but at the same time, it was hypnotizing. She quickly bowed, apologizing. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't see you coming." Her voice trembled, but there was a spark of determination in her tone. Min-ho studied her expression for a moment longer than he intended. Unlike the other employees who avoided making direct eye contact with him, this woman didn't look away. There was something intriguing about how her expression blended nervousness and courage. Even in the face of his overwhelming presence, she remained steadfast. Whispers began circulating around them. Some of Na's colleagues watched in horror, fearing for her future at the company. Others simply observed, waiting to see how the feared CEO would react. Min-ho noticed the murmurs and felt a slight irritation. He didn't like being the center of attention in frivolous situations like this. Without saying another word, he bent down and picked up one of the scattered papers. The simple gesture shocked the onlookers. The CEO, the most powerful man in the company, helping an employee, unusual. He extended the paper to her, keeping his expression unchanged. "Be more careful next time," he said before turning and continuing on his way. Hana let out a deep sigh as soon as he disappeared down the corridor. Her first day at the company, and she had already caught the CEO's attention, and not in a positive way. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but she couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else. There was something about him that stirred a mixture of confusing emotions inside her. Little did she know, that small incident was just the beginning of something much bigger, an event that would change her life forever. Jung Min-ho was a methodical man. His routine was perfectly calculated, leaving no room for mistakes or distractions. However, since the incident with Yoon Hana, he found himself thinking about the assistant more than he would care to admit. There was something about her that bothered him, the way she held his gaze, the courage mixed with fear, the strange feeling she caused him. He tried to ignore it, but it seemed like the universe conspired against his impeccable logic. In the company cafe, Hana was trying to focus on reviewing a document, but her mind was restless. Since the disastrous encounter with the CEO, everyone in the company had started looking at her differently, as if her stay there was hanging by a thread. She overheard whispers in the hallways about how severe Min-ho could be, and she wondered if that mistake would mark her forever. What she didn't expect was for Min-ho himself to walk into the cafe at that moment. The voices around her instantly quieted. He was a man of habits and rarely frequented that space. But for some reason he couldn't even understand. His steps had led him there. Na's eyes widened when he stopped beside her. She quickly began to gather her things, trying to avoid any more awkward encounters. But to her surprise, he sat down at the table next to hers. "Do you always sit here?" His voice was firm, but it didn't carry the usual coldness. Hana blinked, surprised by the approach. "Yes, sir. It's a quiet place to review documents," she replied, maintaining a respectful tone. Minho nodded slightly, observing her for a moment. The silence between them was almost palpable. He didn't understand why he had sat there, but there was something about her presence that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the fact that she didn't show fear like the others. Or maybe it was just his stubbornness in wanting to understand that uncomfortable feeling she stirred in him. "Go ahead," he suddenly said. Hana furrowed her brow. "Pardon me, sir?" "Your work." He indicated the papers with a subtle gesture. "Don't let my presence disturb you." Hana hesitated, but then returned her attention to the documents. However, the awareness of his presence made her heart race. She wondered why he was there, sitting so close, and whether it meant something. Minho, for his part, observed her discreetly. There was something fascinating about this employee. Something that, against his own will, he wanted to understand better. He didn't know yet, but that was only the beginning of his unwanted proximity to Yoon Hana. The days following the unexpected encounter in the cafe brought a strange shift in Min Ho's routine. Whenever he walked through the company corridors, his eyes seemed to unconsciously seek Ha-na's figure. He didn't quite understand why, but something about her caught his attention in a way he couldn't ignore. It was like a persistent discomfort that he couldn't push away. Hana, on the other hand, did everything she could to avoid direct encounters with the CEO. Despite still being unsure of what he wanted when he approached her, she couldn't afford to lose her job over a misunderstanding. Still, fate seemed to have a way of playing with her, putting her in unexpected situations. That afternoon, Hana was called to the meeting room to assist with the documentation of an important business deal. To her surprise, Minho was also present, sitting at the head of the table, closely watching the executives discuss the final details of the contract. The atmosphere was tense. The deal with a major foreign company was on the verge of collapsing due to some conflicting clauses. The air was thick with anticipation, and Minho maintained his serious expression as he listened to every word. At one point, a document was missing, and all eyes turned to Hana, who had been tasked with organizing them. Feeling the weight of the pressure, she quickly flipped through the pages, trying to remain calm. "It's here," she said, finally finding the file and handing it to the CEO. Minho took the document without saying anything, but his eyes locked onto hers for a brief moment. There was something in that interaction that made his heart race, a feeling he insisted on denying. At the end of the meeting, all the executives left the room, but Hana stayed behind to organize the papers. Minho, in no hurry to leave, watched her for a few seconds before finally speaking. "Do you always work with such dedication?" His voice was low, but it carried a tone of curiosity. Hana stopped what she was doing and looked at him, surprised by the question. "I try my best, sir. I know I'm new here and can't afford to make mistakes." Minho nodded, crossing his arms. "Not everyone shows that level of commitment." Hana smiled shyly. "Working here is a privilege." Minho didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching her, as though trying to decipher something about her. Then, before he could realize it, he blurted out a sentence that took him by surprise. "I want you to be my personal assistant." Na's eyes widened. "What?" Minho maintained his firm expression. "Starting tomorrow, you'll work directly with me." Hana felt her heart race. Was this a promotion or the beginning of a big problem? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Her life had just changed forever. Yoon Hana never imagined that her life would change so drastically in such a short time. Being promoted to the personal assistant of the CEO was a privilege that many dreamed of, but it also came with enormous responsibility. Since assuming her new position, she felt the weight of every task, every inquisitive look from the other employees, and, above all, the constant presence of Young Min-ho by her side. The CEO, for his part, was not an easy man to please. He demanded perfection in everything. His time was meticulously scheduled, and he tolerated no mistakes. However, to his own surprise, Min-ho found himself giving Hana more space than he had ever given any other employee. There was something in her that challenged his rigidity, something that made him hesitate to be excessively harsh. Since they started working closely together, he had noticed small peculiarities in Hana. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the subtle way she reorganized materials on his desk when she thought he wasn't looking, and even the slight sigh she let out at the end of a long work session. They were small details, but somehow they seemed fascinating to him. One particularly long night, Hana was reviewing documents next to Minho in his luxurious office. The silence was filled only by the sound of papers being turned and the soft ticking of the clock. Fatigue was beginning to weigh on her, but she knew she couldn't show any weakness. "Do you always work late?" Minho asked, breaking the silence. Hana looked up, surprised by the question. "I do whatever is necessary to fulfill my duty, sir." Minho studied her expression for a moment, before leaning back in his chair. "That's admirable, but even the most dedicated need rest." Hana smiled faintly. "You should follow that advice too, CEO Young." Her spontaneous reply took him by surprise. It was rare for someone to speak to him that way, with such a genuine tone. Minho let out a brief smile, one that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "I rest when the work is done," he replied, but his gaze softened. "Let's call it a day. Tomorrow will be a long one." Hana nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. As she organized the papers, her hand accidentally brushed against Minho's. Both froze for a moment, their gazes meeting. Something indescribable passed between them, a silent current of something neither dared to name. Minho was the first to look away, gathering his documents and standing up. "Rest well, Hana." It was the first time he had called her by her name without formalities, and that made something inside her stir. As she left the office, Hana felt a mix of exhaustion and confusion. The way Minho had looked at her, the way his voice softened when he said her name, that wasn't normal for him. From what she had heard from the other employees, Jung Minho never treated anyone with such attention. So why was it different with her? On the other side, Minho remained still for a few minutes before also leaving. As he entered the car, he felt uneasy. Logic told him that Hana was just an employee, but his heart began to challenge that certainty, and he hated losing control over anything, especially over himself. The following day brought a new challenge for Yoon Hana. From the moment she arrived at the office, she felt the curious glances and whispers that followed her through the hallways. Her recent proximity to young Minho had not gone unnoticed, and the rumors were spreading quickly. Some secretaries looked at her with disdain, while other colleagues simply watched her with unreadable expressions. She tried to ignore it, keeping her focus on her work. But when she entered Minho's office to deliver some documents, she realized that the CEO himself seemed different. His expression was closed off, and he appeared restless, as if something deeply bothered him. The board of directors requested an emergency meeting, he announced bluntly, not looking up from the papers on his desk. Hana frowned. "Is something wrong, sir?" Minho finally raised his gaze to her. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, an unusual hesitation for someone so self-assured. "My father is back from Europe. He wants to meet with me today." Na's heart tightened. Everyone knew that Minho's father, Young Tae-hyun, was a ruthless man. A business magnate, known for his aggressive strategies and his intolerance for any deviation from the plans he set for the family. If he was back, it meant trouble. Minho stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "He wants to discuss my future fiancé." The air seemed to vanish from Hana's lungs. She knew that men like Minho had no freedom to choose whom they married. The Korean elite always arranged unions to strengthen business empires. But hearing that come from his lips made her feel an inexplicable discomfort. "I understand," was all she could respond, keeping her voice neutral. Minho studied her expression for a moment, then sighed. "Hana," his voice was lower now, almost gentle. "Do you think we can challenge fate?" She blinked, confused. "Fate, sir?" He gave her a sideways smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Forget it. It's just a question without an answer." Before she could say anything, he walked past her and left the room, leaving her alone with her own thoughts and a troubling sensation in her chest. Something was about to change, and Hana feared she wouldn't have control over it. Young Minho never liked to be manipulated. Throughout his life, he followed the rules imposed by his family, guided by the strategic coldness of his father. But this time, he would not back down. His heart had already chosen Hana, and no business convenience would change that. The meeting with Yoon Tae-hyun went exactly as he had predicted. Intense and laden with pressure, his father presented a perfect alliance with the heir of a rival conglomerate, securing an even larger empire. Min-ho listened to every word in silence, until he finally spoke. "I'm not interested. I've already chosen who I want to be with." The room fell into a deathly silence. Young Tae-hyun's face became a mask of displeasure. "And who would this woman be, worthy of rejecting an empire?" the magnate asked sarcastically. Min-ho held his gaze, determined. Yoon Hana. The explosion was immediate. His father stood up from his chair, slamming his fist on the table with force. "A mere employee? You've completely lost your mind, Min-ho." But the young CEO remained firm. "I didn't choose Hana for status or strategy. I chose her because I love her." Meanwhile, Hana, who wasn't supposed to be present, had overheard everything from outside the meeting room. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could barely breathe. Min-ho was fighting for her, against his family, against the empire he had built, all for love. When he left the meeting and found her standing outside, no words were needed. Hana ran to him, and Min-ho wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from the world. The following days were turbulent. The board of directors tried to intervene. His parents did everything they could to dissuade him, but Min-ho remained unshaken. In the end, young Tae-hyun understood. His son would never back down. Months later, in a simple yet meaningful ceremony, Min-ho and Hana exchanged vows. Surrounded by close friends and some family, they sealed their love, beginning a new era. And when, a year later, Hana held Min-ho's hand and whispered that he would be a father, they knew they had made the right decision. Against all expectations, they built a family based on true love. Fate can be challenged, and they proved it.